You are depleted. Look into the mirror, not the physical reflection, but the reflection of your psyche. The pervasive fatigue you experience is not merely biological exhaustion, it is the existential depletion of an individual desperately attempting to sustain a persona that objective reality fundamentally refuses to validate. This is the core pathology of our era, an epidemic of neurosis generated by the wholesale flight from empirical truth. I diagnose modern humanity as a sprawling, poorly managed sanatorium, where 90% of the populace sleepwalks, held hostage by scripts they genuinely believe they authored. They navigate, they react, they consume, and they generate angst. Yet they are fundamentally absent from their own locus of control. They are being acted upon, not exercising agency. The clinical diagnosis is unequivocal. Contemporary neurosis is the direct resultant of an over-engineered persona, coupled with a catastrophically repressed shadow. The subject is meticulously trained, from early conditioning, to be non-threatening, predictable, and compliant with the expectations of the collective. They adopt this social mask, the persona, with such fidelity that over time, they suffer from ego inflation, mistaking the facade for their core psychic structure. The critical operational failure here is that the psyche functions as a dynamic, self-regulating system, and empirical truth cannot simply be swept into the peripheral vision. Everything that is subjected to repression, the primal drives, the requisite aggression, the capacity for necessary selfishness, and the inherent impulse for power, does not dissolve. It retreats into the personal unconscious, where it coagulates, organizes itself, and achieves autonomous viability. This is the genesis of the autonomous complexes, trauma fragments endowed with self-will, becoming parasitic anchors within the mental apparatus. When the ostensibly good and harmless individual experiences profound betrayal, or when they engage in repetitive self-sabotage, they are not victims of random misfortune. They are casualties of their own autonomous complexes. These complexes, operating outside conscious executive control, dictate disproportionate emotional reactions, desperately seek external validation, and, crucially, compel the individual to project their own shadow onto the external world. The fatal error, the strategic miscalculation that costs you capital, professional standing, and critically, psychological stability, is idealistic projection. You analyze a negotiation scenario, a relational dynamic, or the corporate power structure, and base your operating strategy on how individuals should behave according to the moral manual dictated by your meticulously groomed persona. You operate under the delusional premise: if I am transparent, they will reciprocate transparency. If I sacrifice my advantage, they will exhibit loyalty. If I display vulnerability, they will offer protection. This constitutes magical thinking, an infantile retreat from psychic reality. The world is not a mirror reflecting your benevolent intentions. It is a field of self-interested, instinctual forces. You are projecting your own, albeit repressed, need for moral rectitude onto third parties, who are operating on a completely distinct level of consciousness and self-preservation. The Florentine master strategist Machiavelli was not promoting malice. He was functioning as a rigorous clinical observer of unvarnished reality. He diagnosed that human nature, when stripped of social coercion, is fundamentally opportunistic, volatile, and governed by underlying fear. His assertion serves as a profound psychological warning. A man who desires to make profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to ruin among so many who are not good. Grasp the clinical weight of this statement. He is not condemning goodness itself, but rather condemning the dependence set upon goodness as a primary psychic defense mechanism. Your goodness, when it is not buttressed by a robust and fully conscious psychic structure that has undergone rigorous shadow work, is an open invitation to exploitation. It is a shield constructed from paper. The majority of you are operating within a bubble of illusion, anticipating that justice will somehow function as a natural law of the cosmos. Shed the illusion. Justice is a fragile human construct, precariously sustained by power structures. What is natural, what is objectively operational, is the relentless pursuit of survival, strategic advantage, and maximum leverage. When you are betrayed, the neurotic reaction is to demand, how could he inflict this upon me after all my investment? This is an emotional inquiry, predicated on your failed projection. It is clinically useless. It serves only to fuel the victim complex. The analyst, the observer positioned outside the emotional perimeter, inquires, what was the net gain for the aggressor? The response is invariably the same: advantage. Individuals always act in service of their own perceived self-interest. Even the most ostentatious altruistic act is, at its root, a pursuit of moral validation, the acquisition of good person status, or the comfort derived from the dopamine hit of perceived righteousness. This is not cynicism. This is the science of motivational dynamics. The collective exists in a state of perpetual cognitive dissonance. They are shocked when the CEO implements layoffs to optimize cost structures, shocked when a partner trades up for higher social capital, shocked when a colleague utilizes gossip for social leverage. Why? Because they refuse to confront the raw data of the collective shadow. They projected the loyalty and decency that they themselves repressed in order to avoid being categorized as bad onto external actors. The shadow is not an entity to be annihilated. It is a component that demands acknowledgement and integration. The individual who refuses to acknowledge the potential for betrayal within their own psychic structure will be eternally blindsided by external treachery. Consider the brutal analogy. Who is more secure? The man who believes the ocean is his friend and harbors affection for him, or the man who respects the ocean's unforgiving, relentless power to drown him? The former preys and drowns. The latter performs shadow work and constructs a robust vessel. You must construct a vessel. The path out of the 90%, the neurotic and reactive, and into the 10%, the conscious and strategic, demands a painful sacrifice, the immolation of your idealistic persona. It mandates that you cease listening to what people articulate and begin rigorously observing what they execute. Words are cheap. They are tools of manipulation, strategically deployed to soften the brutality of underlying intention. If the organizational rhetoric states, "We are a family unit here," but the actions clearly indicate, "You are a disposable resource," prioritize the actions. Action is the pure language of the unconscious. Action reveals the autonomous complex in operation, uncensored by the conscious ego. The individual who initiates the process of individuation is not governed by the emotion of offense, but by the clinical coldness of strategic calculation. They do not inquire, why did they inflict this wound? They inquire, what is the pattern? What is the mechanism operating here? How can I utilize the chaos generated by this subject for my own enhanced stability? This is not an invitation to sadism, but a mandate for psychic responsibility. If you fail to clinically diagnose human nature as it is, instinctual, self-interested, and often structurally cruel, you are condemning yourself to the position of a passive pawn on the strategic board. The 10% are not necessarily superior in academic intelligence. They are superior in consciousness. They have completed the arduous shadow work of confronting their own potential for malice, and consequently, they no longer possess the neurotic requirement to project light and purity onto others. They understand that every human being contains the potential for total ruin. The profound tragedy of modernity is that you have been conditioned to fear your own depth, your own shadow. You have been taught that repression is a virtue, but repression is the fastest route to neurosis and to becoming a manipulable object in the hands of those who are not afraid to gaze into the abyss. Silence is the burden of the conscious man. While the mass engages in frantic chatter to avoid confrontation with internal emptiness and desperately seeks external validation, the 10% remain silent. They observe, they catalog the patterns, the inherent vulnerabilities, the underlying fears. They wait. They grasp that in the high-stakes game of existence, the one who speaks first reveals too much. The one who reacts fastest forfeits leverage. Neurosis is the fundamental inability to tolerate the burden of one's own existence and one's intrinsic nature. You attempt to flee this burden via the persona, through conformity, and through the projection of goodness. But the further you flee, the heavier the neurosis becomes, until the autonomous complex explodes, resulting in clinical collapse, panic episodes, and an overwhelming sensation that life is being lived through you and not by you. The modern subject is pathologically ill because they have engineered a divorce from their psychic totality. They demand to be light exclusively, and consequently, the darkness overtakes them from their blind side. To initiate the awakening, You must accept that psychic reality is not inherently fair, is not gentle, and holds zero regard for your emotional comfort. It is impersonal, instinctual, and demands that you evolve into the cold observer, the clinical scientist of your own existence. You must cease humanizing what requires clinical analysis. Human behavior, particularly within contexts of power and self-interest, must be processed as data, as a predictable algorithmic output. When an operative lies, do not inquire, why did they inflict this wound? Inquire, what is the structural objective of this specific deception? What asset is it designed to protect or acquire? Emotional shock is the luxury the 90% pay for their lack of consciousness. The 10% are not shocked. They register the data point. They anticipated the worst because they have already confronted the worst within their own mental architecture. This is the key to the kingdom of the mind, the brutal clinical acceptance of the inherent duality of human nature. As long as you continue to reside in the fantasy of the good person who will be rewarded solely for virtue, you will continue to be the manipulated pawn. You will remain the emotional and financial reservoir for the autonomous complex of someone more consciously integrated. The collective unconscious of our civilization is saturated with unresolved fears and ambitions. The mass is asleep, awaiting permission from an external authority to truly live. The 10% have realized that the only authority that holds consequence is the one they construct internally, integrating the shadow and operating with eyes wide open to the objective brutality of existence. The task is arduous. It requires solitude and a sustained sacrifice of comforting illusions. But the alternative is slow, neurotic ruin. Choose now the comfort of collective deception or the clinical rigor of individual truth. The time for activation is now. You are urgently required to comprehend the mechanics of the mask you carry. The fatal error condemning 90% of the populace to chronic servitude and entrenched neurosis is not merely a superficial external miscalculation. It is a profound, inherent structural deficiency. I am referring to the persona. The persona is not some flimsy social metaphor. It is an objective psychic structure, an artifact of adaptation. It serves as our social uniform, the facade presented to the external world, meticulously forged from the expectations imposed by parental figures, educational systems, market demands, and prevailing collective morality. Initially, it functions as a necessary psychic defense mechanism, the critical casing protecting the fragile ego from social entropy. Yet like any powerful instrument, it becomes lethal the moment the individual identifies blindly, fatally, with its construct. When I assert that 9 out of 10 are effectively somnambulating, I am stating that 9 out of 10 are operating within a structural falsehood. They are not autonomous individuals. They are ambulatory personas. The model employee, the sanctimonious parent, the cynical academic, the zealous activist, these are all rigidly defined roles. The existential hazard begins when the individual drastically miscalculates the role for the actor. They begin to believe they are the mask. This is the precise inflection point for virtually all contemporary neurosis: total identification with the persona. What is the consequence of becoming your own mask? You are compelled to repress everything that deviates from the script. If your persona is that of the benevolent man or the virtuous woman, you must sweep every ounce of aggression, every impulse of self-interest, all inherent lust, and the entire capacity for manipulation, qualities intrinsic to the human condition, under the psychic rug. This repressed material does not simply dissipate. It cannot be incinerated by sheer willpower or by the recitation of shallow positive affirmations. What the conscious mind rejects is instantaneously absorbed by the personal unconscious, where it condenses, gains psychic weight, and solidifies. This process constitutes the genesis of the shadow. The shadow is your dark psychological counterpart, the repository of every quality you find intolerable in yourself, yet which possesses undeniable reality. The more pristine, polished, and ostensibly flawless the persona you project publicly, the more dense, voracious, and psychologically hazardous your shadow becomes. This is a brutal, relentless law of psychic compensation, operating with the cold precision of physics. The psychic energy expended maintaining the facade is the identical energy that fuels its repressed opposite. You are currently engaged in a perpetual state of internal civil war. The individual identified with the persona perpetually drains their mental reserves to sustain an elaborate illusion. They are not living, they are performing. The cost is a catastrophic disconnection from internal reality. The psyche mandates equilibrium. If the conscious ego insists on being unilaterally good, pure, or harmless, the unconscious initiates retaliation. The shadow is not merely psychological refuse. It contains raw vitality, primal instinct, and the necessary capacity for assertiveness. And yes, for being objectively ruthless when the situation demands it. Essential qualities for survival in a world that, as established, operates without inherent fairness. By repressing the shadow, you do not become more ethical. You become psychologically ineffective and critically vulnerable to debilitating neurosis. And how do the 90% manage this unbearable shadow? Through projection. This is the most prevalent and destructive psychic defense mechanism. The individual cannot tolerate their own avarice, so they project it onto their employer, the government, or their neighbor. They cannot accept their own shadow of envy, so they accuse others of being consumed by it. Stop and clinically observe the collective hysteria of our era, the facility with which people polarize, the speed at which the mass locates an external enemy to hate and demonize. This is not fundamentally a geopolitical phenomenon. It is an epidemic of projection. They are viewing their own autonomous complexes roaming the world stage. The vitriol they feel toward the other is, in fact, the hatred they harbor for the repressed, denied aspects of the self. The man who declares himself entirely virtuous is invariably the one closest to moral collapse, for he lacks self-knowledge of his own depth. He floats upon the mirrored surface of his ego-inflation and inflated persona, utterly oblivious to the psychological abyss opening beneath. And when external pressure becomes intolerable, when the marriage dissolves, the career implodes, or systemic illness strikes, the persona inevitably fractures. What emerges from this fissure? Not reason or inherent goodness. It is the repressed material, the autonomous complexes that have gained critical mass and now possess the power to hijack the ego. This is why we witness ostensibly good individuals suddenly erupting in inexplicable violence or collapsing into self-destructive addictions. This is not a curse, it is the brutal return of the repressed. It is the shadow demanding its essential share of life. The 10% who perceive this high-stakes game are not necessarily morally superior, but they are brutally more honest with themselves. They have completed the initial sacrifice of the persona and commenced the arduous process of individuation. Individuation is not a soft-focused self-help exercise. It is the conscious, voluntary descent into the abyss of your own psyche. It is confronting your shadow and declaring, yes, I am capable of this. I am capable of cruelty, selfishness, and deceit. And now that I possess this awareness, I can choose not to act purely out of compulsion, but rather integrate this capacity and utilize it under the strict control of consciousness. This is the core of effective shadow work. The individual who knows his shadow is dangerous to others only in the sense that he can no longer be manipulated by fear or manufactured guilt. He does not project his inner darkness, allowing him to perceive the darkness of others with clinical clarity, devoid of emotional shock or cognitive dissonance. He understands that the world is driven by self-interest because he has already diagnosed ruthless self-interest within his own psychic structure. If you intend to exit the 90% who function merely as pawns on the board, you must cease prioritizing what others think of you, which is to say, stop feeding the persona. You must tolerate the acute loneliness and the profound silence that descends when you drop the mask. As long as you remain desperate to be liked or validated, you remain at the mercy of the masses' projections and expectations. You will perpetually await permission to act, to speak, to exist. And anyone awaiting permission is, by definition, a subordinate. Therefore, here is the clinical directive. Abandon cheap idealism. Stop anthropomorphizing your own psychic structure. The psyche is a system of brutal, objective forces. The objective is not to be good. The objective is to be complete. It is to integrate the shadow so that it cannot operate autonomously and destructively. This integration is the only viable psychic defense. The majority opts for neurosis, the comforting illusion that they are innocent victims of a cruel world. The clinical truth is they are victims of their own repression and their critically inflated persona. If you are incapable of seeing and accepting your own capacity for ruthlessness, you will inevitably be destroyed by those who have accepted theirs. This is not moral advice. It is a diagnosis concerning psychic survival. The world does not reward a kind heart. It rewards integrated consciousness and cold competence. The cost of true individuation is the sacrifice of your innocence. Do you possess the fortitude to look into the mirror and see not the victim, but the dormant predator? If not, return to your slumber and prepare to be consumed by the autonomous complexes you insist upon denying. The time for playing harmless is over. Psychic reality is objective and utterly brutal. Accept the burden of Jungian analysis. The era of feigning innocence is terminated. The objective reality of the psyche is brutal, unforgiving, and non-negotiable. Accept the clinical burden of self-awareness. Where most individuals fail, and fail catastrophically, is in grasping the fundamental internal architecture that dictates their behavior. You operate under the delusion of a cohesive self, believing the monologue echoing in your skull is the unified voice of your ego. This is not merely wishful thinking. It is a dangerous pathological fantasy, an infantile cognitive dissonance. You are not the sovereign driver of your own apparatus. In the vast majority of cases, you are merely a terrified passenger in a vehicle hijacked by forces you refuse to name. We must institute an immediate clinical deep dive into the autonomous complexes. This is arguably the most critical diagnostic imperative of the current psychological epoch. The psyche, understand this clearly, is not a neatly arranged living room. It is a scorched earth battlefield where internal factions wage relentless, zero-sum warfare for executive control over consciousness. The autonomous complex is the psychic residue of profound emotional trauma, an unresolved wound, or, most commonly, a content violently repressed by the struggling ego. Rather than being integrated into the whole, this content undergoes a process of severe dissociation. It encapsulates itself, forming a self-contained, structurally independent sub-personality. Astonishingly, it develops pathological autonomy. It possesses its own distinct memory structures, its own specific affective charge, and, most alarming for the subject, its own covert, often destructive intention. Think of this structure as a psychic parasite. I am not trafficking in cheap mysticism or New Age jargon. I am discussing a verifiable clinical fact. A segment of your core personality is fissured, and it now operates independently, entirely beyond the jurisdiction of your conscious will. When you erupt in disproportionate rage over a trivial slight, when you consistently execute acts of professional self-sabotage at the critical junctures of your career trajectory, or when you feel compelled to compulsively repeat destructive relational patterns, you are not exercising agency. You are experiencing a complete takeover, a psychic coup d'etat orchestrated by an autonomous complex. The individual dominated by the victim complex, for instance, is structurally incapable of perceiving opportunity. Their entire psychic apparatus is dedicated to fabricating suffering solely to confirm the identity of the martyr. The individual governed by the power complex operates with chilling, tactical cruelty, not out of a conscious ethical decision, but because the complex demands the total submission of the environment to maintain its fragile sense of internal security, a classic case of ego inflation. Modern neurosis is overwhelmingly the manifestation of this internal tyranny. Most subjects flee from accountability by offering the pathetic defense, "I don't know why I did that." My clinical response is immediate. Of course you don't know. It wasn't you who acted, it was your complex. So long as you refuse the imperative of shadow work, so long as you insist on projecting blame, malice, and inadequacy outward onto external factors, the boss, the government, the partner, the system, you are actively fueling the complex. You are supplying it with the necessary operational energy to act autonomously. Projection is not merely a defense mechanism. It is the vital, life-sustaining oxygen that allows the complexes to execute their destructive programming. The modern subject, obsessed with the superficiality of the persona and addicted to the fleeting approval of the mass, is the optimal target. He lives in such profound disassociation from his actual internal reality that when the complex seizes the controls, he registers zero transition. He merely wakes up post-damage, confused, riddled with post-facto guilt, and suffering acute cognitive dissonance. You must internalize this ruthless truth. Your life is not governed by the rational logic you assume you possess. It is governed by these autonomous psychic structures that you insist on maintaining in the operational dark. The individual Machiavelli describes as the player, a tactical operator capable of discerning patterns and leveraging chaos, is fundamentally one who has initiated the grueling process of Jungian analysis and individuation. He is not liberated from complexes, but he possesses a clinical and exhaustive inventory of them. He has integrated a significant portion of his shadow, which grants him a ruthless, cold-blooded clarity regarding human nature, including his own intrinsic flaws. He does not react emotionally because he has already executed the necessary dirty work of confronting his own capacity for betrayal, existential selfishness, and calculated cruelty. When he observes these traits in others, he does not experience shock or moral outrage. He simply diagnoses the structure and proceeds with tactical action. The idealist, the naive subject Machiavelli correctly predicted would be destroyed, is entirely at the mercy of his internal tyrants. He is, in essence, neurosis made manifest. He is the person who trusts blindly, not due to genuine virtue, but because his complex of innocence acts as a potent psychic defense, preventing him from processing raw, objective reality. When this idealist inevitably faces betrayal, the victim complex is activated with maximum force. He does not ask the pragmatic question, what tactical benefit can I extract from this collapse? He resorts to the useless emotional discharge. Why me? How could they do this? This query is functionally worthless. It is a defense mechanism designed specifically to ensure he remains entrenched in his neurosis, and that the complex retains its operational power. The singular viable methodology for disarming an autonomous complex is to starve it of the fuel derived from repression and unconsciousness. You must drag it, violently if necessary, into the harsh light of consciousness. You must submit to sustained clinical observation of your own rage, your envy, your lust for dominance, and analytically ascertain its genesis and its ultimate destructive intention. This is the necessary sacrifice of innocence I referenced earlier. It is an unbearable burden, as it demands that you clinically witness how dangerous, irrational, and fundamentally flawed you truly are. Most subjects opt for neurosis precisely because it offers a perverse comfort. It allows for the complete externalization of responsibility. It is not me, it is the cruel, unjust world. But the cruel world is nothing more than the stage upon which your autonomous complexes execute their programming. If you aspire to be the player, not merely a disposable pawn on the board, the work begins now. You must cease attributing internal psychic reality to exogenous factors. The true chaos resides within. The true tyranny is internal. You are required to construct a resilient psychic structure, capable of containing, modulating, and negotiating with these brutal, instinctual forces. Individuation is not a quest for sanitized moral perfection. It is the ruthless pursuit of psychological totality. It mandates integrating the shadow, absorbing the raw, untamed power currently held by the complexes, and transforming them from internal tyrants into sources of disciplined, conscious power. But be warned, the path to totality is invariably solitary. The mass inherently despises the conscious individual. They prefer shared neurosis, the collective slumber. When you begin to clinically observe the strings that move the world, you inevitably become estranged. They will brand you a cynic, cold, or insensitive. So be it. The clinical diagnosis is definitive. It is preferable to be deemed cold while maintaining sovereignty over your own psyche, than to be lauded as a good person while remaining a hysterical slave to your complexes and the projections of the mass. The self-aware individual is never caught off guard. He understands that human nature is fundamentally flawed, instinctual, and aggressively brutal. He does not petition the world for fairness. He engineers his own internal stability. He remains unaffected by external chaos because he has already stared into the abyss within himself and strategically survived the confrontation. Stop soliciting external validation. Never evade the necessity of silence and internal scrutiny. Forbid the self-deception that the world operates justly. The world is a system of raw power and instinctual drives. Your only viable defense is consciousness. The next stage in this ruthless awakening is the clinical understanding of power dynamics in their purest form, the instinct. There is an endemic fixation on externalizing conflict, identifying the enemy outside the gate, a tyrannical boss, the corrupt politician, the envious competitor. This is merely the most cost-effective and psychically hazardous mechanism of defense available to the human psyche. Projection. The prevailing neurosis of contemporary society is demonstrably an epidemic fueled by this very projection. The modern individual, structurally incapable of sustaining the gaze into their own abyss, their shadow, takes this repressed content, which encompasses everything they condemn, cruelty, self-interest, ruthless ambition, and jettisons it into the external world like toxic psychic effluent. That colleague you despise for their perceived manipulative drive or excessive ambition. Engage in clinical dispassionate self-inquiry. What component of my own shadow, which secretly yearns for leverage or is equally capable of calculated manipulation, am I currently projecting onto that specific individual? This is the essential first step of shadow work. The chronic victim archetype is the undisputed master of projection. They systematically refuse to integrate the fact that they harbor the identical instincts for power, cruelty, and self-interest they so vehemently condemn in others. They insist on moral purity, on occupying the good side of the narrative, a textbook case of pathological self-deception and acute cognitive dissonance. This neurotic fixation on purity constitutes a paper persona, structural lie the psyche constructs to evade the existential burden of psychological totality. This evasion is a fundamental expression of ego inflation disguised as virtue. The antagonist, in your personal narrative, the monster that perpetually haunts your perimeter, is almost invariably your own shadow projected outward. It is your inherent capacity for malicious intent, for aggression, or strategic betrayal that you rigidly refuse to acknowledge. By refusing this acknowledgement, you remain perpetually vulnerable. You cannot effectively neutralize an enemy whose existence you deny within your own psychic structure. This diagnostic error carries fatal systemic consequences, fundamentally compromising your psychic defense mechanisms. Cease this infantile performance of self-pity and victimology. Terminate the delusion of inherent innocence. The diagnosis is unforgiving. If you find yourself consistently betrayed, deceived, or strategically undermined, the core failure is not the prevalence of external malice, but your chronic inability to conduct effective shadow work, to recognize the latent darkness in both yourself and others. You project an idealized sense of self, and you are subsequently consumed by the very malice you have repressed into the unconscious. When you execute true shadow work, when you integrate this repressed material and state, yes, I am capable of calculated cruelty. Yes, I possess the capacity for profound self-interest. Yes, I carry the destructive drive of the primal instinct. You effectively disarm the mechanism of projection. You draw the enemy back into your own psychic structure, where it can be contained, managed, and, crucially, strategically utilized. The purpose of the shadow is not eradication, it is integration. It is the reservoir of your raw force, your fundamental vitality. Those who repress the shadow simultaneously repress their own life force, rendering themselves structurally ineffective and pathologically neurotic. Authentic power is not derived from naive benevolence, but from the conscious capacity to embody whatever psychological state is strategically required. The individual who is intimately acquainted with their own destructive potential is the only one truly equipped to choose, not to deploy it. The individual who denies this potential remains an autonomous complex awaiting detonation, or an easy target structurally positioned for predation. This is the central tenet of Jungian analysis. Modern neurosis demands that we maintain a facade of public virtue, yet this superficial goodness is merely a fragile, approval-seeking persona engineered primarily for social validation. Beneath this thin veneer, autonomous complexes are actively fermenting, saturated with repressed psychic energy, poised either to sabotage the individual's life trajectory or to be violently projected onto a convenient scapegoat. The sacrifice demanded by the rigorous process of individuation is the relinquishing of your cherished moral innocence. You must confront the fractured mirror and accept that the monster bears your exact countenance. This refusal to accept the whole self is the root cause of psychic collapse. This systemic flight from internal responsibility is precisely what fuels the operational power of the mass. The mass functions as the ultimate sanctuary for the psychologically cowardly. It is the environment where individual accountability is systematically dissolved. When you merge with the collective, You surrender your hard-won consciousness to the collective unconscious, allowing the autonomous complexes of the society to seize operational control. Observe the pathology of herd behavior, the moral hysteria, the relentless pursuit of an external enemy suitable for ritualistic lynching. This is not morality. This is pure, undiluted neurosis. It is the collective shadow violently projected onto an accessible target. The mob does not engage in thought. It merely reacts. It is purely instinctive, operating beneath the threshold of conscious control, driven by primitive emotional complexes. You require silence. You require enforced solitude to systematically dismantle this mechanism of projection. As long as you remain submerged in the pervasive noise and the opinions of others, you will remain nothing more than a passive receptor for the complexes of the mass. The individual engaged in the rigorous process of individuation is structurally an outsider. They possess no clinical need to endorse the prevailing hysteria. They require no external validation. Their validation is strictly internal. They possess a clinical awareness of their identity and a brutal assessment of their capabilities. They become a fixed point of stability amidst the accelerating systemic chaos. The price exacted for consciousness is acute solitude. It is a profound burden, but the structural alternative is psychic collapse, the fate of becoming a hysterical puppet, jerked by the strings of autonomous complexes you refuse to acknowledge or integrate. Consider your professional trajectory. You perpetually lament injustice and lack of recognition. But have you clinically analyzed the raw instinct that governs that environment? It is not ethical frameworks that dominate. It is the inherent primordial hierarchy of instinct. The power structure is not a community. It is a highly sophisticated predatory ecosystem. The individual who has mastered shadow work fears neither confrontation nor being confronted. They grasp that conflict is an inherent non-negotiable component of existence. They do not engage in self-pity when attacked. They clinically dissect the aggression, searching for the underlying instinctive motivation. They do not pose the question, "Why did this happen to me, Sai?" They pose the strategic question, "What demonstrable leverage did they gain from this action?" The fatal error is the excessive humanization of the power environment, the assumption that your superior or your competitor operates based on the same values of fair play that your constructed persona demands. They do not. They operate via the instinct for survival, the acquisition of leverage, and the acute fear of losing positional advantage. They are driven by autonomous complexes, not by abstract ethical ideals. You must cease the compulsive idealization of others. View them clinically as complex instinctive structures, driven by their underlying complexes: affection, loyalty, and alliance. These phenomena are tangible, certainly, but they exist in perpetual, agonizing tension with the instinct for self-preservation and the desire for hierarchical dominance. Those who willfully ignore objective psychic reality, who insist on the fabrication of a just and gentle world, are structurally condemned to serve as the janitors for those who have embraced reality's harsh calculus. The process of psychological awakening is not a gentle ascent. It is brutal. It is akin to being violently immersed in frigid water. The primary reaction is shock, followed by rigid denial. But the mandatory subsequent reaction must be the unflinching acceptance of the stark, unadorned reality. Your established neurosis is your strategic refuge. It is the psychological mechanism that permits you to declare, "I am not culpable for the systemic collapse occurring." To fracture this neurosis necessitates accepting the burden of consciousness, and this burden is exceptionally heavy. It demands the clinical understanding that your life, your stability, and your influence are predicated solely on your capacity to integrate the ugly, the brutal, the fundamentally unconscious elements of your being. The modern individual is suffering from a profound pathology because they have systematically severed their connection to the instinctive base of the psyche, while simultaneously failing to cultivate a consciousness potent enough to contain the resulting chaos. They are a structural failure, fragile on the surface due to ego inflation, yet teeming internally with autonomous complexes ready to enact self-destruction. You must execute the burial of the victim archetype. It is an autonomous complex that systematically drains your vital resources. It functions as the engine for the perpetual projection of blame and responsibility. If you intend to operate as the strategist, the player, and not the disposable pawn. You must terminate the search for external culprits and initiate the rigorous search for patterns. The pattern of betrayal, the pattern of manipulation, the pattern of neurosis, and the most critical pattern, the repeating configuration by which you consistently position yourself for psychic injury. This is not arbitrary misfortune. This is the compulsion to repeat, an autonomous complex acting through your behavior, a core failure of your psychic defense system. The only unconscious pattern that structurally imprisons you is the one you are unwilling to ruthlessly confront. The remainder is merely the predictable dance of the complexes. Awaken. The operational window is closing. The neurosis of the mass is accelerating towards systemic collapse. Those unprepared for the sacrifice required by consciousness will be inevitably consumed by the collective unconscious, reduced to a statistical data point, a mere symptom in the unfolding pandemic of psychic failure. The immediate next phase requires construction. It demands the deliberate utilization of instinct. It is the absolute mastery of your own psychic structure, so that you can finally cease reacting and commence calculated action. Terminate projection. Look inward and confront the enemy. It is your most powerful, untapped resource. The diagnosis is established. Mass neurosis is the undisputed theater of operations. It is clinically futile to continue lamenting that the world lacks fundamental fairness, or that the populace is inherently superficial. This is not a moral failing. This is objective psychic reality. The collective unconscious operates outside the jurisdiction of your personal morality or your idealized concept of goodness. It responds exclusively to force, to primal instinct, and to immutable psychic structure. The vast majority of individuals, when confronted with this brutal truth, attempt one of two fundamental psychic escapes. They either succumb to the neurosis of the victim, projecting the entirety of their shadow material onto the external world and demanding recompense for perceived injustice, or they attempt to fabricate a caricature of the villain, falling prey to the superficial power trap of ego inflation masked as the persona. Both responses are manifestations of arrested development. Both trajectories conclude inevitably in psychic ruin and the total collapse of the self-regulating mechanism. The decisive path, the transition from being a mere pawn to becoming the active player, is the process of individuation. And here, I must be surgically precise. Individuation is not a soft, comforting journey of self-discovery. It is a bloody, necessary sacrifice. It demands the unblinking acceptance of your own abyss. It necessitates the deliberate and painful integration of your shadow. This is the core of rigorous shadow work. The shadow is not merely your occasional bad temper or a collection of minor, easily forgiven flaws. The shadow encompasses your total, unmitigated capacity for brutality, ruthless self-interest, and calculated destructiveness. It is the reservoir of potential malevolence within you that, if unleashed without conscious control, could inflict irreparable systemic damage. The modern individual commits a fatal error. They attempt to repress this shadow entirely. They strive to be excessively good, perpetually enlightened, using superficial virtue as a fragile, paper-thin armor against reality. This is the foundation of modern neurosis. What is the consequence of repressing your destructive potential? It does not dissolve. It achieves autonomy. It coalesces into an autonomous complex. It gains a sinister life of its own within the unconscious. And, like a psychic parasite, it demands expression through projection onto the external environment. This is the clinical explanation for why the idealist, the ostensibly good man, who systematically refuses the ruthless self-inventory required for shadow work, is perpetually surrounded by bad people who invariably betray him. He is not a victim of circumstance. He is living out his own unintegrated shadow through the actions of others. He functions as a precise magnet for betrayal because he refuses to acknowledge, let alone master, his own intrinsic capacity for calculated deceit. The resulting cognitive dissonance is immense and debilitating. You must cease this projection immediately. You are tasked with bringing the shadow into the cold, harsh light of consciousness. This does not imply a mandate for cruelty or an endorsement of reckless action. It means you must examine the full potential for ruthlessness within your own psychic structure and state without equivocation. I am capable of this degree of destruction. I understand the precise mechanism of this power. And because I understand it completely, I retain absolute control over its deployment. This ruthless self-inventory is the singular method for developing a consciousness robust enough to handle the objective reality of the external world. If you refuse to recognize your own potential for being utterly relentless, you will remain perpetually naive, transparent, and utterly predictable to those who have already integrated their own shadow, or, far worse, to those who are wholly dominated by it. The individual who knows himself entirely, who accepts his totality, the hero and the tyrant coexisting within the same psychic structure, is the only operative who can function effectively in the world without being dominated by neurosis, whether that neurosis is internal, complexes, or external, mass hysteria. Once shadow integration commences, you require active, strategic mechanisms of psychic defense against the contagion of mass neurosis. The gravest danger to the individuated self is emotional contamination, the infectious spread of collective hysteria. The mass operates exclusively through crude, reactive, and binary emotional states: fear, raw anger, and the desperate craving for external approval. For the analyst, for the strategic player, the most vital tool is what must be termed holy indifference. Do not confuse indifference with clinical apathy. Apathy is merely the absence of feeling, a neurotic flight from reality. The indifference I propose is a state of clinical, objective detachment. It is the sophisticated capability to observe emotional chaos, calculated manipulation, gossip, and the pervasive projection of others without being sucked into the gravitational pull of their drama. When an external agent attempts to manipulate you through the vectors of guilt, rage, or cheap flattery, your internal psychic structure must remain an impenetrable fortress. You must perceive the attack not as a personal offense demanding emotional reaction, but as an autonomous complex operating through a weak, unintegrated individual. What is the precise gain they seek? What is the underlying repeatable pattern? The common man reacts. He registers the offense, immediately launches a defense, and attempts to articulate or explain his feelings. He expends precious, vital energy feeding the autonomous complex of the other party. The individuated agent, the scientist of the psyche, does not react. He observes, collects behavioral data, and maintains a strategic silence. Silence is your most potent tactical weapon. Silence is the absolute barrier that prevents the autonomous complexes of others from rooting themselves within your own structure. When confronted with drama, hysteria, or a clear attempt at psychological control, your primary instinctive response must be tactical retreat and calculated silence. Words are cheap. They are, in the majority of cases, utilized primarily to disguise the actual underlying intention. Silence, however, is the absence of projection. It forces the manipulative party to confront the existential void they are desperately attempting to fill with their neurosis. Holy indifference means you must systematically stop caring whether or not you are liked by the collective. The desperation for external validation is the single largest autonomous complex driving modern society. It transforms intelligent, capable individuals into emotional slaves, fostering a pervasive state of ego inflation that is easily punctured. You are not here to be universally loved by the mass. You are here to achieve completeness. And completeness, the rigorous process of Jungian analysis and individuation, is invariably a solitary, isolated path. The greatest psychological sacrifice demanded by individuation is the acceptance of absolute solitude. The moment you withdraw from the collective slumber, the instant you begin to clearly perceive the patterns, the projections, and the autonomous complexes acting through your friends, family, and professional peers, you become, functionally, an alien. The awakened individual becomes a structural anomaly to the mass neurosis. The mass cannot tolerate divergence. It demands strict emotional and intellectual conformity. If you are not reacting with the requisite level of fear, or the standardized measure of indignation as the majority, you are immediately classified as cold, cynical, or, most dangerously, strategically calculating. This is the critical juncture where most aspirants abandon the process. It is psychologically easier to return to sleep, to resume projecting, to revert to being the pawn who feels a comforting sense of belonging, even if that belonging is rooted in a shared neurotic illusion. The player, however, grasps that true security resides not in social approval, but in the structural integrity of the internal psychic structure. Solitude is not a penalty. It is the necessary clinical precondition for objectivity. You cannot effectively analyze the game while you are immersed in the screaming crowd below. You must withdraw, ascend the mountain, and observe the movements below with detached precision. The burden of consciousness is intrinsically heavy. It signifies that you can no longer leverage ignorance as a permissible excuse. It necessitates that you must shoulder the responsibility for every single choice, knowing that the vast majority of people surrounding you are merely following the pre-programmed script dictated by the collective unconscious. If you desire the power to act, rather than merely react, you must accept this formidable burden. The individual who refuses to be reduced to a number in the mass, who refuses to be dominated by autonomous complexes, inevitably becomes a target of systemic projection. They will label you selfish, calculating, and emotionally frigid. And you must receive these projections with holy indifference. You possess the internal certainty of who you are. Recall the words of Machiavelli, translated directly into psychic reality. If you attempt to operate based on idealized, unintegrated goodness in a world dominated by autonomous complexes and mass neurosis, you will be systematically destroyed. The individual who has constructed his vessel, who has successfully integrated the shadow and mastered the underlying instinct, holds a profound respect for the destructive power of the ocean. He understands that the human psyche is a brutal, unforgiving system. Neurosis is aggressively contagious. The only viable psychic defense is your disciplined individuality, your clinical detachment. Cease the futile search for external paradise. It does not exist. The only operational space where you will achieve control, where you will be the active player, is within the boundaries of your own psychic structure. If you fail to construct this internal fortress now, the inevitable collapse of mass neurosis, which is already well underway, will utterly consume you. Repression universally creates complexes, and complexes operating on a mass scale generate collective hysteria and total societal breakdown. The time for intellectual naivety has expired. Look to the world, conduct a ruthless inventory of your shadow, and commence the rigorous work. The sacrifice is profoundly painful, but it remains the only verifiable route to actual freedom. Everything else is sleep, and sleep leads directly to ruin. Wake up. The game has commenced, and you must seize the dice. The diagnosis is straightforward, yet the brutal acceptance of it constitutes the terminal affliction for the majority. The psyche remains utterly indifferent to your subjective emotional state. It functions as an objective, often brutal, psychic structure, governed by immutable laws of power dynamics and equilibrium, mirroring the indifference of natural law. The fatal cognitive error that consigns 90% of the population to inevitable psychic collapse is the persistent, infantile insistence on anthropomorphizing what is, fundamentally, an autonomous complex. When engaging in conflict or strategic negotiation, you are not interfacing with a rational, benevolent, or inherently fair human being. You are confronting a highly pressurized, reactive system of psychic defense mechanisms, deeply embedded fears, and repressed primal instincts. The individual presented to you is merely the social persona, a superficial construct utilized to navigate the endemic collective neurosis. The collective unconscious demands strict adherence to predictability. It requires you to follow the established script. The individual who refuses this mandated trajectory, the strategic actor, the player in this psychological theater, is not operating from malice. They are operating with clinical precision. They have acquired the tactical map of the battlefield. They understand that the vulnerability fetishized by the mass is, in objective reality, merely an explicit invitation for psychic sacrifice. You must immediately cease projecting your own repressed shadow onto external figures. What you vehemently condemn in the designated villain is frequently the precise trait you fear and have most aggressively repressed within your own psychic structure. The individual who perceives pervasive betrayal and rapacious greed in every transaction is often the one most terrified of their own capacity for avarice and treachery. Until you undertake the necessary shadow work and integrate these disowned aspects, they will remain projected, guaranteeing your status as the collateral damage of another's autonomous complex. This is the iron law of Jungian analysis. What is clinically defined as individuation is not a comfortable linear process of contemporary self-help. It is a profound, sacrificial act, an abyssal descent into the core structure of the self. It necessitates the enforced solitude of the individual, who chooses to shoulder the immense isolating burden of consciousness. The comfort afforded by neurosis is profoundly seductive. It requires vastly less psychic expenditure to indict the system, fate, or external bad actors than to acknowledge oneself as a passive agent, refusing to confront the naked reality of existence. It is easier to remain within the collective trance, holding hands while murmuring platitudes about how the world ought to be equitable. But the world is not equitable. Justice is a fragile, sophisticated construct, artificially imposed by structures of power and codified law, not an inherent natural principle. What is natural is raw instinct, the zero-sum struggle for dominance, and the supremacy of self-interest. The individual who awakens, who transitions from being a mere pawn to becoming the strategic player, embraces this existential frigidity. They cease the infantile lamentation, "Why is this happening to me?" and pivot to the diagnostic query. What tactical leverage does this provide? What underlying psychic pattern does this incident reveal? They do not suffer shock, they diagnose. The vast majority of individuals exist in a state of chronic, sustained shock. They exhibit profound cognitive dissonance when a marriage collapses, when market dynamics shift, or when loyalty is demonstrably breached. Why? Because they operate under a fundamentally flawed diagnosis of psychic reality. They place their faith in superficial declarations, in the persona, rather than in the raw, objective action driven by the autonomous complex. This failure to differentiate between the ego and the objective psyche leads inevitably to repeated instances of ego inflation, followed by devastating collapse. You have now reached the point of no return. The mechanisms are exposed. The cables are visible. The operational mechanism has been revealed. You now face a binary choice, and there is no provision for retreat or negotiation. The first choice: comfort and inevitable collapse. You are permitted to dismiss this clinical assessment, labeling it excessively cynical or unduly cold, and retreat back into the comfortable anonymity of the mass. You can persist in seeking external validation, fearing the necessary solitude, and projecting your unintegrated shadow onto the world. Should you choose this path, you revert to being a disposable piece on the board. You become perfectly predictable. Your own autonomous complexes will dictate your reactive behavior, rendering you easily manipulated by those who have accepted objective psychic reality. You will subsist and perish trapped within a terminal state of neurosis, perpetually confined to the compulsion to repeat. The anesthetic comfort of ignorance is a slow-acting poison, but its efficacy in guaranteeing psychic ruin is absolute. The second choice: pain and sovereign consciousness. You must accept that the psyche operates as an inherently dangerous system, that shadow work is a mandatory requirement for integration, and that the isolating solitude inherent to individuation is the non-negotiable price of genuine freedom. Your imperative is to construct your fortified internal psychic structure, your vessel, designed specifically to navigate the chaotic oceanic currents of the unconscious. This demands the cessation of emotional reactivity, the termination of seeking approval from the mass, and the adoption of the cold, diagnostic mindset of a scientist analyzing data. It requires accepting the severe burden of becoming the objective observer, the operating surgeon, and the clinical strategist, rather than remaining the passive, suffering patient. Neurosis is the defining psychological pathology of our era, manifesting universally as the flight from objective reality. The belief that individuals are inherently good, that effort automatically guarantees commensurate reward, or that mere verbal truth is sufficient to protect you from consequence, represents the most insidious form of psychic evasion. It is a self-administered lie designed to circumvent the necessity of real, difficult shadow work. The game is already underway. The collective hysteria, the profound social polarization, and the systemic chaos you observe externally are merely the symptomatic eruptions of uncontained mass autonomous complexes. If you fail to withdraw now to construct your internal psychological fortress, utilizing robust psychic defense mechanisms, you will be violently swept away by this rising tide of collective pathology. You do not need to become a moral antagonist to be the strategic player. You require psychological maturity. You must discard all remnants of naivety. You must gaze unflinchingly into the abyss, fully integrate your shadow material, and accept the profound, isolating burden of consciousness. There is no provision for a conventional happy ending. There is only the rigorous, ceaseless work of maintaining consciousness. Wake up. The silence of solitude is the only operative environment where the foundational work of individuation can commence. For the select few prepared to exit the collective neurosis and accept the full responsibility of consciousness, the work awaits. The era of psychological innocence is officially terminated.